My cousin betrayed me at Grandma's funeral until everyone discovered who really inherited everything. The smell of lilies mixed with cigarette smoke hit Sarah Martinez like a slap as she stepped out of the funeral home's side entrance. Her black dress wrinkled from hours of accepting condolences from people she barely recognized. Her grandmother's viewing had lasted 6 grueling hours, and all she wanted was 5 minutes of fresh air before the burial ceremony tomorrow. Instead, she found herself face to face with her cousin Marcus, who was supposed to be inside comforting grieving relatives, not out here whispering urgently into his phone while pacing behind the building's dumpsters. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Yeah, I'm telling you it's done, Marcus was saying, his voice carrying that familiar, arrogant tone that had grated on Sarah's nerves since they were children. The old lady never saw it coming. Sarah's got no idea what's about to hit her. He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end, then let out a low chuckle that made Sarah's skin crawl. Trust me, by tomorrow afternoon, everything will belong to the rightful heir. Grandmother Elena always favored me anyway. Sarah pressed herself against the brick wall, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure Marcus would hear it. The cigarette smoke she'd smelled wasn't coming from any mourners. It was drifting from Marcus's lips as he celebrated what sounded like the theft of her grandmother's entire estate. The woman who had raised Sarah from age 12, who had worked 3 jobs to put her through college, who had spent her final months making sure Sarah understood the family recipes and traditions, that woman's body wasn't even cold yet, and Marcus was already dividing up her belongings like spoils of war. 24 hours earlier, Sarah had been rushing through the corridors of St. Mary's Hospital, her nursing shoes squeaking against the polished floors as she tried to make it to room 314 before visiting hours ended. She'd pulled a double shift covering for a colleague whose child had fallen ill, and exhaustion weighed on her shoulders like a lead blanket. But nothing could have kept her away from her weekly visit with grandmother Elena, the woman who had been her anchor through every storm life had thrown her way. Elena Martinez sat propped up against pristine white pillows, her once vibrant brown eyes now dulled by medication and pain, but her smile still carried the warmth that had comforted Sarah through countless childhood nightmares and teenage heartbreaks. At 87, Elena's body was failing, but her mind remained sharp as the day she immigrated from Guatemala with nothing but a suitcase and an unshakable belief that hard work could overcome any obstacle. "Mija," Elena whispered as Sarah entered, her voice barely audible over the steady beep of the heart monitor. "Come sit. I need to tell you something important." Sarah pulled the uncomfortable hospital chair closer to the bed and took her grandmother's weathered hand in hers. Her skin felt like tissue paper, fragile and thin, but her grip was surprisingly strong as she squeezed Sarah's fingers. "The lawyers came today," Elena continued, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Everything is in order now. The house, the savings, the land in Guatemala that your grandfather left me. It's all going to you, Sarah. You're the only one who truly understood what family means." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "Abuela, don't talk like that. You're going to get better. The doctors say—" "The doctors say many things," Elena interrupted with a gentle smile. "But I know my time is short, and I need you to know that I've made sure you'll be taken care of. The will is with Attorney Rodriguez downtown. Everything I own will be yours, because you've been the daughter I never had, the granddaughter who never forgot where she came from." They talked for another hour about family recipes, about Elena's plans for Sarah to take over the small bakery she'd run for 30 years, about the importance of preserving their family's traditions. Elena made Sarah promise to continue sending money to their relatives in Guatemala, to keep the family cemetery plot maintained, and to never let anyone convince her she wasn't worthy of the life Elena had worked so hard to provide. When visiting hours ended, Sarah kissed her grandmother's forehead and promised to return the next day. she never got the chance. Elena Martinez passed away peacefully in her sleep at 3:17 a.m., surrounded by the night shift nurses who had grown to love her gentle spirit and endless stories about the granddaughter she adored. The phone call came as Sarah was finishing her morning coffee, preparing for what she thought would be another routine day at the hospital. Instead, she found herself racing back to St. Mary's, not as a nurse, but as a grieving granddaughter, her world suddenly empty without the woman who had been her constant source of strength and unconditional love. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, phone calls to relatives scattered across the country, and the crushing weight of grief that seemed to press down on Sarah's chest with every breath. She took bereavement leave from work, spending her time sorting through Elena's belongings in the small house on Maple Street where she'd grown up after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12. Everything in the house told a story. The worn wooden table where Elena taught Sarah to make tamales every Christmas morning, the collection of ceramic angels that crowded the mantelpiece, each one representing a prayer for Sarah's safety and happiness. The framed photographs that chronicled Sarah's journey from a scared orphan child to a confident woman with a nursing degree and a bright future ahead of her. It was while she was going through Elena's desk that Sarah first noticed something odd. The small wooden secretary, where Elena kept all her important papers, was unusually disorganized, with documents scattered and file folders out of order. Elena had been meticulous about paperwork her entire life, a habit born from years of navigating immigration bureaucracy and small business ownership. She would never have left her affairs in such disarray, especially not when she knew her time was limited. Sarah was still puzzling over the disorganized papers when the doorbell rang. She opened it to find Marcus standing on the porch, his perfectly pressed expensive suit despite the summer heat, and his expression a carefully crafted mask of grief that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Cousin," he said, pulling her into an embrace that felt more performative than genuine. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Aunt Elena was truly one of a kind." Marcus had always called Elena aunt, even though she was actually his grandmother too, the mother of his father who had died when Marcus was young. But unlike Sarah, Marcus had grown up in wealth and privilege with his mother's family, visiting Elena only on holidays and special occasions, always with an agenda that involved borrowing money or asking for favors. "Thank you for coming," Sarah replied, stepping back from his embrace. "I know Abuela would have wanted you here." Marcus glanced past her into the house, his eyes scanning the living room with an intensity that made Sarah uncomfortable. "I was hoping we could talk about the arrangements and about Aunt Elena's affairs. I know this must be overwhelming for you, and I want you to know I'm here to help with whatever needs to be done." Something in his tone set off warning bells in Sarah's mind, but grief had clouded her usual sharp instincts. She invited him in, and they spent the next hour discussing funeral plans, with Marcus insisting on handling the more expensive aspects of the service, despite Sarah's protest that she could manage the costs herself. "Please," Marcus said, his hand on her shoulder, in what should have been a comforting gesture, but felt somehow possessive. "Let me do this for Aunt Elena. She meant so much to all of us, and I have the resources to give her the send-off she deserves."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
It was only later, after Marcus had left with promises to handle the funeral arrangements and coordinate with the other relatives, that Sarah realized she hadn't seen him shed a single tear or share a single genuine memory of Elena. For someone who claimed to be devastated by their grandmother's death, he seemed remarkably composed and focused on practical matters rather than emotional ones. The funeral service itself was a beautiful tribute to Elena's life, held at St. Catherine's Church where she had attended Mass every Sunday for 40 years. Marcus had indeed spared no expense, filling the church with elaborate flower arrangements and hiring a mariachi band to play Elena's favorite songs. But as Sarah sat in the front pew, accepting condolences from the steady stream of mourners, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Marcus moved through the crowd like a politician at a campaign event, shaking hands and accepting sympathy with the practiced ease of someone who had never met a stranger. He introduced himself to people as Elena's grandson and spoke eloquently about his grandmother's legacy, but Sarah noticed that his stories were generic, lacking the specific details that would come from years of close relationship. More troubling was the way Marcus seemed to be studying the mourners, particularly the older relatives who had traveled from out of state for the service. He lingered in conversations with Elena's elderly friends, asking pointed questions about family history and Elena's financial affairs that struck Sarah as inappropriate for a funeral setting. It was Elena's longtime neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who first voiced what Sarah was beginning to suspect. "That boy of yours," she whispered to Sarah during a quiet moment near Elena's casket. "He came by the house yesterday asking questions about your grandmother's papers. Wanted to know if she ever mentioned hiding money or valuables anywhere. Seemed odd timing, if you ask me." Sarah's blood ran cold. "He went to Abuela's house?" Mrs. Chen nodded, her weathered face creased with concern. "Said you'd sent him to pick up documents for the lawyer. But when I mentioned it to Mrs. Rodriguez next door, she said she'd seen him there twice this week, both times when you weren't around. We thought maybe you knew." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. The disorganized desk, Marcus's sudden interest in handling funeral arrangements, his pointed questions about Elena's affairs. Sarah excused herself from Mrs. Chen and made her way to the church bathroom, her mind racing as she tried to process what she was learning. Marcus had been in Elena's house without her knowledge, going through her grandmother's private papers while Sarah was grieving and planning the funeral. But why? What could he possibly be looking for among Elena's belongings? The answer came to her as she stood in the small bathroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror above the sink. The will. Marcus was looking for Elena's will, probably hoping to find some way to challenge it or, worse, to alter it before anyone else could see it. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled out her phone and dialed the number for Rodriguez and Associates, the law firm that had handled Elena's legal affairs for over 20 years. Attorney Rodriguez himself answered, his voice warm with sympathy as he offered his condolences. "Mr. Rodriguez," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I need to know about my grandmother's will. When can we schedule the reading?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sarah, dear, I'm confused. Your cousin Marcus was here this morning to collect the will. He said you'd asked him to handle the legal arrangements since you were too overwhelmed with grief to deal with the paperwork yourself." The phone nearly slipped from Sarah's numb fingers. "He what?" "He had a notarized letter of authorization with your signature, said you were too distraught to come in person. I must say I was surprised given how involved you've always been in your grandmother's affairs, but the paperwork seemed legitimate." Sarah gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles white with tension. "Mr. Rodriguez, I never signed any letter of authorization. I never asked Marcus to collect anything from your office. He took my grandmother's will under false pretenses." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Attorney Rodriguez had been practicing law for 40 years, and he recognized the gravity of what Sarah was telling him. "Sarah, we need to meet immediately. If what you're saying is true, we're dealing with fraud and theft of legal documents. Can you come to my office right now?" Sarah glanced at her watch. The funeral service would continue for at least another hour, followed by the burial ceremony at Forest Hill Cemetery. Everyone would expect her to be there, to play the role of the grieving granddaughter accepting comfort from her extended family. But if Marcus had Elena's will, if he was planning to manipulate or destroy it, every minute counted. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she told Rodriguez, then ended the call and hurried back into the church. Marcus was standing near the altar, deep in conversation with Elena's elderly sister Carmen, who had traveled from Phoenix for the funeral. As Sarah approached, she could hear him asking Carmen about Elena's early years in Guatemala, about properties the family might have owned, about financial arrangements that might not have been formally documented. "Marcus?" Sarah interrupted. Her voice louder than she had intended, several heads turned in their direction, but she no longer cared about maintaining the appearance of family unity. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" He looked annoyed at the interruption, but followed her to a quiet corner of the church.
What is it, Sarah? We're in the middle of honoring Aunt Elena's memory. Were you planning to tell me that you went to Attorney Rodriguez's office this morning? Sarah asked, watching his face carefully for any sign of guilt or surprise. For just a moment, Marcus's carefully maintained mask slipped, and Sarah saw something calculating and cold flicker across his features. But he recovered quickly, arranging his expression into one of confused innocence. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I've been busy with funeral arrangements all morning. Why would I go to a lawyer's office?" Sarah studied his face, remembering all the times during their childhood when Marcus had lied with the same wide-eyed expression of injured innocence. He'd perfected the art of deception early, learning to manipulate adults with his charm while bullying younger cousins when no one was watching. "Rodriguez says you collected Abuela's will using forged authorization papers," Sarah said quietly. "He's expecting me in his office in 15 minutes to file a police report for theft and fraud." This time, Marcus couldn't hide his reaction. His face flushed red, then went pale, and Sarah could see the rapid calculation happening behind his eyes as he weighed his options. "Sarah, you're obviously overwrought with grief," he said finally, his voice taking on a patronizing tone she remembered from their childhood. "You're not thinking clearly. Maybe you did ask me to handle the legal paperwork and forgot about it. This has been a traumatic time for all of us." The audacity of his lie was breathtaking, but it also confirmed everything Sarah had begun to suspect. Marcus wasn't just opportunistic, he was dangerous. He was willing to gaslight her, to make her question her own sanity in service of whatever scheme he was running. "Where is my grandmother's will, Marcus?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he replied, but his eyes had shifted away from hers, focusing on something over her shoulder. "And I think you need to be careful about making accusations you can't prove. Grief can make people paranoid, Sarah. Maybe you should talk to someone professional about what you're going through." Sarah realized that several relatives had drifted closer during their conversation, drawn by the tension in their voices. Marcus was playing to an audience now, positioning himself as the concerned cousin dealing with an unstable relative. It was a masterful performance, and Sarah could see from the worried looks on her family members' faces that it was working. "I think we should continue this conversation later," Marcus said loudly enough for the others to hear, "after we've laid Aunt Elena to rest with the dignity she deserves." He turned and walked away while their relatives exchanged concerned glances. She could almost hear their whispered conversations. "Poor Sarah, the stress has been too much for her. It's understandable, really, losing the woman who raised her. Maybe Marcus is right to be worried about her mental state." But Sarah knew what she'd heard on the phone with Attorney Rodriguez. She knew Marcus had Elena's will, and she was increasingly certain that whatever was in that document was worth enough to Marcus that he was willing to commit fraud to get his hands on it. The question was, what could Elena have owned that would drive her grandson to such desperate measures? The answer to that question would have to wait. Sarah made her excuses to the remaining mourners, claiming she needed to step outside for some fresh air, and drove directly to Rodriguez's office downtown. The elderly lawyer was waiting for her, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by grave concern. "Sarah, I've been handling your grandmother's affairs for over 2 decades. In all that time, Elena never once failed to handle her own business personally. She was one of the most organized and decisive people I've ever worked with. The idea that she would delegate something as important as her will to anyone, especially at such a crucial time, should have raised immediate red flags." He handed Sarah a copy of the authorization letter that Marcus had presented that morning. Even at first glance, Sarah could see problems with the document. The signature was close to hers, but the pen pressure was wrong, and the formation of certain letters was slightly off. More damning was the date on the letter. It was dated 3 days before Elena's death, when Sarah was at the hospital for her double shift and could prove she was nowhere near a notary public. "This is definitely forged," Sarah said, studying the document. "But Marcus must have had access to examples of my signature to get this close. How would he have gotten those?" Rodriguez frowned as he shuffled through his files. "That's what's been bothering me. The signature is too good to be a random forgery. Whoever created this had multiple examples to work from, and they understood your handwriting patterns." He paused, and then looked up at Sarah with dawning realization. "Sarah, did Marcus have access to any documents you'd signed recently? Anything with your grandmother's papers?" Sarah's mind raced back through the past week. Marcus had been at Elena's house multiple times, according to the neighbors. He'd been going through her desk, going through her files, and Elena had always kept copies of everything, including documents Sarah had signed over the years for various family matters. "He's been in Abuela's house," Sarah said, slowly. "Mrs. Chen said she saw him there at least twice this week. He could have found old contracts, loan papers, anything with my signature on it." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "That would explain the quality of the forgery. But Sarah, what concerns me most is why he went to such elaborate lengths to get the will."
In my experience, people don't commit felonies unless the stakes are very high. Your grandmother was comfortable, but she wasn't wealthy enough to justify this level of criminal behavior unless— He trailed off, his expression thoughtful. "Unless what?" Sarah prompted. "Unless there was something in the will that Marcus knew about but you didn't. Something valuable enough to risk everything for." Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah's face. "Did your grandmother ever mention property in Guatemala? Investments you weren't aware of? Any family assets that she might not have discussed with you?" Sarah shook her head slowly. Elena had always been open about her finances, involving Sarah in decisions about the bakery, the house on Maple Street, and the modest savings account she'd built up over decades of careful budgeting. There had never been any indication of hidden wealth or secret assets. But as Sarah sat in Rodriguez's office, trying to piece together Marcus's motivations, a memory surfaced from her last conversation with Elena at the hospital. Her grandmother had mentioned the land in Guatemala that your grandfather left me, but she'd said it so casually that Sarah had assumed it was just a small family plot, maybe a few acres of farmland with sentimental value. "Mr. Rodriguez," Sarah said slowly, "what if it's not about money? What if it's about land?" Elena mentioned property in Guatemala, but she made it sound insignificant. "Could Marcus know something about that land that I don't?" Rodriguez's eyebrows shot up. "Land in Guatemala?" "Sarah, depending on the location and what's been discovered there recently, Guatemalan property could be worth a fortune. There's been significant development in certain regions, mining rights, agricultural expansion. If your grandmother owned property in the right area," he let the implication hang in the air. The pieces were beginning to form a picture that made Sarah's stomach turn. Marcus hadn't just stumbled into this scheme, he'd been planning it. Somehow, he'd learned that Elena owned valuable property in Guatemala, property that Sarah knew nothing about. He'd realized that Elena intended to leave everything to Sarah, and he'd decided to steal the will before Sarah could discover what she was inheriting. "We need to get that will back," Sarah said, her voice harder than she'd ever heard it. "And we need to find out exactly what Marcus knows that I don't." Rodriguez nodded. "I'll contact the police immediately. With the forged authorization letter and your testimony, we have enough evidence to get a search warrant for Marcus's residence. But Sarah, if I'm right about the potential value of this property, Marcus may be desperate enough to destroy the will rather than let you inherit. We need to move fast." As Sarah left Rodriguez's office and drove back toward the funeral, her phone buzzing with missed calls from relatives wondering where she'd disappeared to, she realized that the conversation she'd overheard behind the funeral home was just the beginning. Marcus had stolen Elena's will, probably forged legal documents, and was planning something that would leave Sarah with nothing of the legacy Elena had worked so hard to build. But Marcus had made one crucial miscalculation in his calculations. He'd underestimated Sarah, assuming she was too grief-stricken and naive to recognize what was happening until it was too late. He'd forgotten that Elena had raised her granddaughter to be strong, to be observant, and to never back down from a fight when something important was at stake. As Sarah pulled into the funeral home parking lot where the burial service was about to begin, she spotted Marcus standing near the entrance, checking his phone with an expression of barely concealed anxiety. He looked up as her car approached, and for a moment, their eyes met through the windshield. Sarah saw the exact moment when Marcus realized that she knew. His face went through a rapid succession of emotions: surprise, calculation, and finally, a cold determination that sent chills down her spine. This wasn't just about greed anymore. This was about family, about legacy, and about the truth of who Elena Martinez really was and what she'd built during her years in America. The burial ceremony was about to begin, but Sarah knew the real drama was just getting started. Marcus had stolen Elena's will, but he hadn't counted on the strength and intelligence of the granddaughter Elena had raised. The woman who had taught Sarah that family meant everything had also taught her that sometimes you have to fight to protect what matters most. As mourners gathered around Elena's gravesite for the final farewell, Sarah made a silent promise to her grandmother. She would recover the will, uncover the truth about the Guatemalan property, and make sure that Elena's true wishes were honored. Marcus might think he'd won by stealing legal documents and manipulating family members, but he was about to learn that underestimating Sarah Martinez was a mistake he'd regret for the rest of his life. The war for Elena's legacy was about to begin, and Sarah intended to win. The cemetery dirt felt cold under Sarah's black heels as she stood at the edge of her grandmother's grave, watching the mahogany casket being lowered into the earth while Father Miguel recited the final prayers in Spanish. The words that had once brought her comfort now seemed to drift past her like smoke, meaningless against the roar of anger and determination building in her chest. Around her, relatives dabbed at their eyes with tissues and whispered prayers for Elena's soul, but Sarah's attention was fixed on Marcus, who was standing directly across from her on the other side of the grave. He was performing grief beautifully. His head bowed in apparent sorrow, his expensive suit perfectly pressed despite the humid afternoon heat. But Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed against his thigh when he thought no one was looking, and the frequent glances he shot toward his phone. He was waiting for something, and that something had nothing to do with honoring our grandmother's memory. As the ceremony concluded and relatives began to drift away in small groups, sharing memories and making plans for the traditional family dinner that would follow, Sarah noticed Marcus pulling his phone from his pocket and stepping away from the crowd. She watched him answer with a curt nod, speaking in low tones that she couldn't quite catch over the sound of the cemetery groundskeepers beginning to fill in the grave. This was her chance. While Marcus was distracted with his mysterious phone call, Sarah approached Carmen, Elena's elderly sister who had flown in from Phoenix for the funeral. Carmen had been closer to Elena than anyone in the family, and if there were secrets about Guatemalan property or hidden assets, she would know about them. "Tia Carmen," Sarah said softly, taking the older woman's arm as they walked slowly back toward the parking area.
Could I ask you something about Abuela's early years? Marcus was asking about property in Guatemala, and I realized I don't know much about what Abuelo left behind when he died. Carmen's weathered face creased with confusion. Property in Guatemala? Mija, your grandfather never owned any land there. He was a poor man when he married your grandmother, just a laborer working other people's fields. That's why they came to America. There was nothing for them back home. Sarah felt her stomach drop. But Abuela mentioned land in Guatemala when we talked at the hospital. She said it was part of what she was leaving me. Carmen stopped walking, her grip tightening on Sarah's arm. Elena said that? Are you sure? Because, Sara, your grandmother never owned any property in Guatemala. She used to send money to relatives there, yes, but she never bought land or invested in anything back home. She always said this country gave her everything she needed. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. If Elena didn't own land in Guatemala, then what had she been referring to in the hospital? And more importantly, what was Marcus really after, if not some hidden property investment? Carmen, Sarah said carefully, did Elena ever mention anything else? Any other investments or assets that the family might not have known about? Carmen's eyes sharpened, and Sarah could see the older woman's mind working. There was something, she admitted slowly. But Elena made me promise never to tell anyone, not even you. She said it had to stay secret until after she died. Sarah's heart began to race. What kind of secret? Carmen glanced around nervously, making sure they were out of earshot of the other relatives. Your grandmother found something, Sarah. About 20 years ago, when she was going through your grandfather's things after he passed, hidden in an old toolbox in the garage, wrapped in oilcloth like it was precious. What did she find? Documents, Carmen whispered. Very old documents from before your grandfather came to America. Land grants, mining rights, something about property that belonged to his family generations ago. Elena didn't understand what they meant, but she had them translated by a professor at the university. The man told her they were potentially very valuable, but also very dangerous. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Dangerous how? The land those documents described, it wasn't just farmland, mija. It was in a region where they've been finding minerals, rare earth metals, things that big mining companies would pay fortunes for. But the professor warned Elena that claiming those rights could bring attention from people who wouldn't want some poor immigrant woman standing in the way of their profits. Carmen's voice dropped even lower. So Elena hid the documents. She made copies and put the originals in a safety deposit box, but she never filed any claims or tried to pursue the rights. She said it was too dangerous, that she'd rather live modestly and safely than risk her family's lives for money. Sarah's mind was reeling. This wasn't about land Elena owned. It was about land rights that her grandfather's family had held for generations. Rights that could be worth millions if the mineral deposits were as valuable as Carmen suggested. And somehow, Marcus had learned about these documents. Carmen, Sarah said urgently, does anyone else in the family know about this? Carmen said she only told one other person, about 5 years ago when Marcus was going through his divorce and claimed he needed money for lawyers. Elena felt sorry for him, thought maybe it was time to let the family benefit from what your grandfather had left behind. She showed him the documents and explained what they might be worth. Sarah's blood turned to ice. 5 years ago. That was around the time Marcus had started visiting Elena more frequently, around the time he'd inserted himself into her grandmother's life with sudden enthusiasm. He hadn't been motivated by family affection. He had been planning this theft for years. But Elena changed her mind, Carmen continued. She said Marcus scared her with his reaction to the documents. He wanted to file claims immediately, to sell the rights to the highest bidder without considering the consequences. Elena realized he didn't understand the danger, or maybe he just didn't care. So Elena told him she'd decided to not pursue the matter and made him promise to forget what she had shown him. And he promised? Carmen's expression darkened. He promised, but Elena never trusted him after that. She said there was something in his eyes when he looked at those documents, something that reminded her of the men back in Guatemala who would kill their own families for a few acres of worthless land. She was afraid of him, Sarah. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Marcus was walking towards them, his phone call apparently finished, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes alert and focused on their faces. "Ladies," he said smoothly, "I hope you're not standing out here in this heat."
Carmen, you look tired. Maybe Sarah should drive you back to the house so you can rest before dinner. There was something in his tone that made Sarah's skin crawl, a subtle threat wrapped in concern. He'd been watching them, possibly listening to their conversation, and now he was trying to separate them, to prevent Carmen from sharing any more dangerous information. "Actually," Sarah said, linking her arm through Carmen's, "Thea and I were just discussing family history. She was telling me some fascinating stories about Abuelo's life in Guatemala. Maybe you'd like to hear them too, Marcus." She watched his face carefully, looking for any sign that he recognized the significance of what she was saying. For just a moment, his mask slipped, and she saw a flash of the cold calculation she remembered from their childhood. "I'm sure they're interesting," he said carefully, "but I think Carmen needs to get out of this sun. Why don't we continue this conversation later, when everyone's more comfortable?"
Carmen looked between Sarah and Marcus, and Sarah could see the older woman beginning to understand that something was wrong. Actually, Carmen said, her voice stronger than it had been all day, I think I'd like to stay here a bit longer. This is the last time I'll be able to visit Elena, and I'm not ready to leave yet. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, he said. Take all the time you need. Sarah, could I speak with you privately for a moment? There are some details about the will reading that we should discuss. Sarah felt every instinct screaming at her not to go anywhere alone with Marcus, but she also knew this might be her only chance to confront him directly about what she'd learned. Of course, she said, squeezing Carmen's arm in what she hoped the older woman would recognize as a warning to stay alert. Marcus led her away from the gravesite toward a secluded area near the cemetery's old mausoleum. As soon as they were out of earshot of the other mourners, his entire demeanor changed. The grief-stricken grandson disappeared, replaced by someone Sarah barely recognized. "What did Carmen tell you?" he asked without preamble. Sarah kept her expression neutral. She shared some memories about Abuela and Abuelo, family stories, nothing more. "Don't lie to me, Sarah." Marcus stepped closer, and Sarah could smell the expensive cologne that didn't quite mask the scent of cigarettes and something else. Fear, maybe, or desperation. "I saw the way you two were whispering. Carmen knows something, and now so do you." "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah replied, but even as she said it, she was calculating distances to the parking lot, to other people, to anywhere that would be safer than this isolated corner of the cemetery. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You were always a terrible liar, cousin. Even when we were kids, I could always tell when you were hiding something." He pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. "See this? This is a picture of some very interesting documents that I found in dear Aunt Elena's house. Documents that she never should have kept, considering how dangerous they could be in the wrong hands." Sarah's heart sank as she recognized photocopies of what must be the mining rights documents Carmen had described. Old, yellowed papers, covered in Spanish text and official-looking seals. Even in the poor quality of the phone image, she could see that these were the real thing. Legal documents that could potentially be worth millions. "Where did you get those?" she demanded. "From Elena's house, of course. She was cleverer than I gave her credit for, hiding them in a fake bottom of her jewelry box, but not clever enough to realize that I'd been looking for them for 5 years. Marcus's smile was cold and triumphant. "Did you really think she'd leave them to you? Poor little Sarah, the granddaughter who works as a nurse and lives paycheck to paycheck? These documents are worth more money than you could earn in 10 lifetimes. "Those documents don't belong to you," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "They belong to Abuela, and according to her will, everything goes to you," Marcus interrupted. "But here's the thing about wills, Sarah. They only matter if they actually make it to probate court. And this particular will seems to have gotten lost somewhere between the lawyer's office and the courthouse." Sarah stared at him in horror. "You destroyed it." "I did what was necessary to protect the family's interests. Elena was getting senile in her old age, making decisions that could have put all of us in danger. Do you have any idea what would happen if word got out that our family has claims to mineral-rich land in Guatemala? We'd have mining companies, government officials, maybe even cartels coming after us. Elena was too naive to understand the risks. So you decided to steal everything for yourself. I decided to handle the situation responsibly. These documents are going to be sold to a private collector who understands their value and knows how to manage the associated risks. The money will be invested properly, used to benefit the entire family instead of being wasted on Elena's sentimental charity projects and your nursing school loans." The casual cruelty in his voice was breathtaking. Marcus had stolen Elena's will, stolen documents that represented generations of family history, and was planning to sell them to the highest bidder, all while convincing himself that he was the responsible one in the situation.
What about what Abuela wanted? Sarah asked. What about her wishes for how these documents should be handled? Marcus shrugged. Elena was an old woman who never understood the modern world. She spent her whole life working 3 jobs and living in a tiny house because she was too afraid to take the risks necessary to build real wealth. I'm not going to make the same mistakes. Sarah realized that arguing with Marcus was pointless. He'd already made his decision, already committed crimes to get what he wanted. The only question now was how far he was willing to go to protect his scheme. "What happens to me in all of this?" she asked. "You'll be fine," Marcus said dismissively. "Elena left you the house and the bakery, which is more than enough for someone with your simple needs. Consider yourself lucky that I'm not contesting the will entirely. I could have made a case that Elena wasn't mentally competent when she signed it." "You can't contest a will that you destroyed." Marcus's smile widened. "Who says I destroyed it? For all anyone knows, Elena never had a will at all. It's remarkably easy for important documents to go missing when old people die, especially when they're not organized about their affairs." Sarah felt sick. Marcus had thought of everything, planned for every contingency. He'd stolen the will, stolen the documents, and was prepared to gaslight the entire family into believing that Elena had died intestate, leaving her assets to be divided according to state law, which would give Marcus a significant share as her next of kin. "You won't get away with this," Sarah said. But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were true. Marcus had money, connections, and a 5-year head start on his planning. What did she have except suspicions and the testimony of an elderly aunt? "Actually, I think I will," Marcus replied, "because the only person who knows the truth is Carmen, and who's going to believe the confused memories of an 80-year-old woman, especially when those memories involve far-fetched stories about valuable mining rights and mysterious documents?" He was right, and they both knew it. Without the original will, without the documents themselves, Sarah had no proof that Marcus had stolen anything. It would be his word against hers, and he had the advantage of seeming like the rational, successful family member, while she would look like the grief-stricken granddaughter making wild accusations. "I should get back to the family," Marcus said, checking his watch. "People will start to wonder where we are. But Sarah, I want you to think very carefully about what happens next. You can accept the situation as it is, take your inheritance of the house and bakery, and live a comfortable life. Or you can try to fight this and lose everything, including your reputation and possibly your safety." The threat was unmistakable. Marcus wasn't just stealing Elena's legacy, he was warning Sarah that resistance would be dangerous. The documents might be valuable enough to attract the attention of dangerous people, but Marcus himself was becoming dangerous too. "I need to think about this," Sarah said finally. "You do that," Marcus agreed, "but don't think too long. I'll be filing the paperwork to settle Elena's estate within the next few days, and once that process begins, it will be very difficult to change course." As they walked back toward the parking area, Sarah's mind was racing. Marcus had the documents, had destroyed the will, and was planning to profit from Elena's death while leaving Sarah with just enough inheritance to avoid suspicion. He'd thought of everything except one crucial detail. Elena had taught Sarah that family meant fighting for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. And Sarah had learned something from her years as a nurse that Marcus, for all his planning, had overlooked. Sometimes the most important evidence wasn't in documents or legal papers. Sometimes the truth was hidden in the details that only someone who really knew and loved Elena would notice. As they rejoined the family gathering, Sarah caught Carmen's eye and gave her a subtle nod. The older woman's expression sharpened with understanding. Marcus might have the documents and the destroyed will, but he didn't have all the secrets Elena had kept. And he'd made the fatal mistake of underestimating the 2 women who had loved Elena most. The traditional family dinner was held at Rose's restaurant, the same place where Elena had worked as a waitress when she first arrived in America 50 years ago. The current owner, Miguel Rosa, had insisted on hosting the gathering as his tribute to the woman who had helped build his family's business.
The back room was filled with the warm smell of homemade tamales, fresh tortillas, and Elena's favorite mole sauce. But Sarah barely tasted the food as she sat at the long table, surrounded by relatives sharing memories and stories. Marcus held court at the head of the table, regaling the assembled family with tales of Elena's generosity and wisdom, painting himself as the devoted grandson who had been closest to their beloved matriarch. He spoke eloquently about Elena's legacy, about the importance of family unity during difficult times, and about his commitment to honoring her memory in the years to come. It was a masterful performance, and Sarah could see that it was working. Relatives who barely knew Marcus were nodding in approval, impressed by his apparent devotion and his articulate tributes to Elena. He was positioning himself as the natural leader of the family in Elena's absence, the responsible one who could be trusted to handle her affairs and guide the next generation. But Carmen was watching Marcus with the sharp eyes of someone who had lived long enough to recognize a performance when she saw one. And Sarah noticed that Miguel Rosa, who had known Elena for decades, seemed increasingly uncomfortable as Marcus continued his elaborate eulogy. It was during a pause in Marcus's speech that Miguel cleared his throat and addressed the table. "If I may," he said in accented English, "Senora Elena, she was not just my employee many years ago. She was my teacher, my advisor, sometimes my banker when times were hard.
And she was very, very careful about money and documents. Very organized." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Miguel was leading up to something important. "2 months ago," Miguel continued, "Senora Elena came to see me. She was worried," she said, "worried that someone in the family might try to take advantage after she died. So she asked me to keep something safe for her, something very important." Marcus had gone very still, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. "What kind of something?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Miguel smiled sadly. "She said it was insurance, in case anyone tried to claim she didn't know her own mind when she made her will. She left with me copies of all her important papers, including her will and some old documents that belonged to her husband's family. She said if anything happened to the originals, these copies would prove what she really wanted." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat as she stared at Marcus, watching the color drain from his face. He'd been so careful, so thorough in his planning, but he'd never considered that Elena might have made backup copies of everything. "That's—" Marcus began, then stopped, clearly struggling to find words that wouldn't incriminate him. "That's wonderful," Carmen said loudly, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. "Elena always was careful about important papers. Miguel, would it be possible for Sarah to see these copies? As Elena's heir, she'll need them to settle the estate." Miguel nodded enthusiastically. "Of course. Senora Elena, she told me to give everything to Sarah when the time came. I have them locked in my office safe, waiting." Sarah felt a surge of emotion so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Even in death, Elena was protecting her, had anticipated Marcus's betrayal and taken steps to prevent it. Her grandmother had known exactly what kind of man Marcus was, and she'd prepared for his treachery. "Actually," Marcus said, his voice slightly strained, "as the male head of the family, perhaps I should handle the legal documents. Sarah is still grieving, and these matters can be quite complex." "No," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying clearly through the restaurant. "I'll handle my grandmother's papers myself. Thank you, Miguel. When would be convenient for me to collect them?" "Tomorrow morning. I open the restaurant at 6, but you can come any time after 8 when the morning rush is finished." Marcus opened his mouth as if to object again, then seemed to think better of it. Around the table, relatives were nodding approvingly at Sarah's decision to take responsibility for Elena's affairs. Any attempt by Marcus to override her now would look suspicious and controlling. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of conversation and shared memories, but Sarah was barely present for any of it. Her mind was focused on tomorrow morning, on the documents waiting in Miguel's safe,
on the moment when she would have proof of Marcus's crimes and evidence of Elena's true wishes. Marcus left the restaurant early, claiming he had important business to attend to, but not before shooting Sarah a look that was equal parts fury and calculation. She knew he was planning his next move, trying to figure out how to salvage his scheme now that backup copies of the documents existed. After the other relatives had gone back to their hotels or begun the long drives to their home cities, Sarah lingered at the restaurant with Carmen and Miguel. In the empty back room, with the dinner dishes cleared away and the staff cleaning up for the night, Miguel retrieved a thick envelope from his office safe. "Señora Elena, she was very specific about what I should tell you. She said if anyone tried to claim she was confused or didn't know what she was doing, these papers would prove otherwise. She also said there might be people who would try to take what belonged to your grandfather's family, people who didn't understand the danger." Sarah opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were photocopies of dozens of documents: Elena's will, bank statements, property deeds, and the mysterious papers that Carmen had described. But there was also something else, a handwritten letter in Elena's careful script addressed to Sarah. "Mi querida nieta," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone and someone has tried to steal what belongs to our family. I have hidden the original documents where only you can find them. But first, you must understand what they mean and why they are so dangerous." The letter went on to explain the history of the documents, how Elena's father-in-law had been granted mineral rights to vast tracts of land in Guatemala in the 1920s, rights that had been forgotten during decades of political upheaval, but were still legally valid. Recent geological surveys had confirmed that the land contained valuable deposits of rare earth metals, making the rights potentially worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But Elena's letter also warned of the dangers involved in claiming those rights. Mining companies had killed people for far less valuable claims. Government officials could be bribed or threatened. Even family members might become enemies when such wealth was at stake. "I have decided that this burden should not fall on our family. But if someone tries to steal these rights for their own profit, then you must fight back. Not for the money, mija, but for the principle that family should protect family, not betray it." The letter included detailed instructions for finding the original documents, hidden in a place that only Sarah would think to look. It also included the name and contact information for a lawyer in Guatemala City who specialized in mining rights and could help Sarah understand her legal options. As Sarah finished reading, Carmen and Miguel watched her face carefully. They could see the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, the realization that she was now the keeper of secrets that could change her life forever. "What will you do?"
Carmen asked softly. Sarah looked down from the letter, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. Elena had faced the same choice 20 years ago when she first discovered the documents. She'd chosen safety over wealth, family over profit. But Marcus had forced Sarah into a different situation, one where doing nothing meant letting him profit from betrayal and theft. "I am going to stop him," Sarah said quietly. "Elena trusted me to protect our family's legacy, and that's exactly what I'm going to do." Outside the restaurant, Marcus sat in his car in the parking lot, watching the lights in the back room where Sarah was learning the truth about her inheritance. He'd already made several phone calls, setting his backup plans in motion. If he couldn't steal the documents quietly, he'd have to take more drastic measures. The mining rights were worth too much money to give up now, and he'd already committed crimes that could send him to prison if Sarah decided to involve the police. He'd crossed too many lines to back down, which meant Sarah had become more than just an obstacle to his plans. She'd become a threat that needed to be eliminated. As Sarah emerged from the restaurant with Carmen and Miguel, Marcus started his engine and pulled out of the parking lot. He had work to do, arrangements to make, problems to solve. Sarah thought she'd won tonight, but the game was far from over. The documents that Elena had died protecting were about to become the center of a war that would test everything Sarah believed about family, justice, and the price of fighting for what was right. Marcus had spent 5 years planning his theft, but Sarah had something he'd never possessed: Elena's love, Elena's wisdom, and Elena's unshakable belief that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect. The battle for Elena's legacy was about to begin in earnest, and only one of them would emerge victorious. The morning sun cast long shadows across Elena's kitchen as Sarah carefully moved the heavy wooden cabinet that had stood against the far wall for as long as she could remember. According to her grandmother's letter, the original documents were hidden behind a loose brick in the wall, a hiding place that Elena had chosen specifically because it was in the one room where Sarah had spent countless hours learning family recipes and absorbing her grandmother's wisdom about life, love, and survival. Sarah's fingers traced the mortar lines until she found the brick that shifted slightly under pressure. Behind it was a waterproof pouch containing documents that were even older and more fragile than the copies she'd seen at Miguel's restaurant. These papers bore official seals from the Guatemalan government dating back nearly a century, written in formal Spanish that spoke of mineral rights, land grants, and territorial claims that spanned thousands of acres in what was now one of Guatemala's most geologically valuable regions. As Sarah photographed each document with her phone, she could hear a car pulling into the driveway. Through the kitchen window, she saw Marcus climbing out of his silver BMW, his face grim with determination. He wasn't alone this time. A second man emerged from the passenger seat, someone Sarah didn't recognize, but whose expensive suit and cold demeanor immediately set off alarm bells in her mind. Sarah quickly sealed the original documents back in their hiding place and slipped out through the back door, cutting through Mrs. Chen's yard to reach her own car parked on the next street. As she drove away, she could see Marcus and his companion approaching the front door, Marcus using the key that Elena had given him years ago when she'd still trusted him. Her phone rang as she navigated through the morning traffic toward downtown, where Attorney Rodriguez was waiting to examine the documents. The caller ID showed Carmen's number, but the voice that answered was strained with fear. "Sarah, you need to be very careful," Carmen whispered. "Marcus came to my hotel room an hour ago with some man I've never seen before. They were asking questions about what I told you yesterday, about whether I had any documents or knew where Elena might have hidden things. The man with Marcus, he wasn't asking politely." Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Are you safe? Where are you now?" "I'm in the hotel lobby. But Sarah, they know. They know I told you about the Guatemala papers, and they know you were at Miguel's restaurant last night. Marcus is getting desperate, and desperate people do dangerous things." The line went dead, leaving Sarah with the chilling realization that Marcus had escalated far beyond simple theft. He was now actively threatening elderly family members and had brought in outside help to handle what he obviously considered a serious problem. The stranger with Marcus wasn't family. He was probably a lawyer, an investigator, or worse, someone whose job was to make problems disappear. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop looking for things that don't belong to you. Some family secrets are better left buried." The message was followed by a photo that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was taken from inside Elena's house, showing the kitchen cabinet moved away from the wall and the loose brick exposed. Marcus had found the hiding place, which meant he now knew that Sarah had the original documents. Attorney Rodriguez was waiting in his office with 2 additional lawyers from his firm, both specialists in international property law and mining rights. Sarah spread the photographed documents across the conference table, watching as the legal experts examined each page with growing amazement. "Sarah," Rodriguez said after an hour of careful analysis, These documents are authentic and legally binding. Your great-grandfather's family was granted extensive mineral rights by the Guatemalan government in 1923, rights that were never revoked or transferred. According to our preliminary research, the land described in these grants is located in the same region where several major mining companies have been conducting exploratory operations. One of the international law specialists, a woman named Patricia Vega, looked up from her laptop where she had been researching recent geological surveys. The conservative estimate for the value of these mineral rights is somewhere between $200 and $400 million. But Sarah, claiming these rights would involve substantial legal challenges, significant personal risk, and years of litigation in both American and Guatemalan courts. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. Elena had been sitting on a fortune that could have changed their entire family's life, but she'd chosen to keep it secret because she understood the dangers involved. Now Marcus was willing to commit crimes and threaten family members to get his hands on those same rights. "What are my legal options?" Sarah asked. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "First, we need to deal with Marcus's theft of your grandmother's will and his fraudulent attempt to claim the documents. I've already filed a police report, and Detective Morrison will be interviewing you this afternoon about the forged authorization papers. Second," Dr. Vega continued, "you need to decide whether you want to pursue the mining rights claims. If you do, we'll need to file paperwork in Guatemala City within the next 60 days where the rights could be declared abandoned under current Guatemalan law. And third," the second specialist added, "you need to consider your personal safety. Mining rights worth this much money have a way of attracting very dangerous attention, both from legitimate companies and from criminal organizations that operate in that region."
Sarah thought about Elena's warning in the letter, about the dangers of pursuing wealth that could destroy a family. But she also thought about Marcus's betrayal, about his willingness to drug his own cousin and threaten elderly relatives to steal what didn't belong to him. Elena had chosen safety over justice, but Marcus had forced Sarah into a situation where doing nothing meant letting evil triumph. "I want to stop Marcus first," Sarah decided. "Whatever happens with the mining rights, he can't be allowed to profit from theft and fraud." Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "Detective Morrison will want to hear your complete statement about Marcus's activities. But Sarah, I should warn you that white-collar crimes can be difficult to prosecute, especially when the defendant has resources to hire expensive lawyers." "Marcus has resources, but he doesn't have the truth," Sarah replied. "And he doesn't have Elena's backup documents or the testimony of witnesses who saw him going through her house without permission." The meeting was interrupted by Sarah's phone ringing. The caller ID showed Miguel Rosa's number, but when she answered, his voice was tight with worry. "Sarah, you need to know that 2 men came to my restaurant this morning asking about the papers I gave you last night. They claimed to be lawyers settling your grandmother's estate, but they didn't feel like lawyers to me. They felt like trouble." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing. I told them I didn't know what they were talking about, that I only knew Señora Elena as a former employee. But Sarah, they knew too much about you, about your family, about things they shouldn't have known unless someone told them." After ending the call, Sarah realized that Marcus was systematically tracking down everyone who might have information about Elena's documents. He was no longer trying to hide his actions or maintain the pretense of being a grieving grandson. He was operating openly, using intimidation, and possibly worse, to silence anyone who could expose his crimes. The afternoon meeting with Detective Morrison took place at the downtown police station, where Sarah provided a complete statement about Marcus's fraudulent activities. The detective, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, listened carefully as Sarah described the forged authorization papers, the theft of Elena's will, and Marcus's confession to destroying legal documents. "The problem we're facing," Detective Morrison explained,
is that most of this is he said, she said without physical evidence. Marcus can claim that your grandmother authorized him to handle her affairs, and without the original will, it's difficult to prove otherwise. But what about the forged signature on the authorization letter? Sarah asked. That's our strongest evidence, especially since we can prove you were at the hospital during your shift when the letter was supposedly notarized. But even if we can make fraud charges stick, Marcus could claim he was acting in what he believed to be your grandmother's best interests. Sarah's frustration mounting. Marcus had committed multiple crimes, threatened family members, and stolen documents worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but the legal system seemed ill-equipped to stop him quickly enough to prevent further damage. There is one thing that might help, Detective Morrison continued. If Marcus is working with outside parties, if he sold or promised to sell these mining rights to third parties, then we're looking at conspiracy charges that carry much more serious penalties. Sarah thought about the stranger who had accompanied Marcus to Elena's house, about the professional way they'd intimidated Carmen and questioned Miguel. How would we prove something like that? We need evidence of financial transactions, communications with potential buyers, something that shows Marcus is operating as part of a larger scheme rather than just a family dispute over inheritance. The detective's words gave Sarah an idea. Marcus was arrogant and overconfident, convinced that his superior education and resources made him untouchable. But arrogance often led to mistakes, and mistakes left evidence. That evening, Sarah drove to Marcus's upscale apartment complex in the city's financial district. She wasn't planning to confront him directly. That would be too dangerous now that he'd shown his willingness to involve outside help. Instead, she positioned herself in the parking garage where she could observe his comings and goings without being seen. At 8:30, Marcus emerged from the elevator accompanied by the same stranger Sarah had seen at Elena's house. But this time, there was a third man with them, someone whose expensive suit and confident bearing suggested serious money and serious connections. The three men stood beside Marcus's BMW, speaking in low tones while Marcus showed them something on his phone, probably the photographs he'd taken of the original documents. Sarah used her own phone to record the meeting, capturing clear images of all three men and their license plates. The stranger from earlier was driving a black sedan with corporate plates, while the third man had arrived in a limousine with diplomatic or government tags. As she watched, Marcus handed over a manila envelope to the man with government plates, receiving in return what looked like a cashier's check. The transaction was quick and professional, the kind of exchange that suggested an established business relationship rather than just a one-time deal over inheritance. After the men separated and drove away in different directions, Sarah followed the government-plated limousine at a safe distance. It led her to the Guatemalan consulate downtown, where the man disappeared inside the building. Sarah sat in her car across the street, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. Marcus hadn't just stolen Elena's documents, he'd already sold them to someone with connections to the Guatemalan government, probably a corrupt official who could expedite the process of claiming the mining rights while bypassing normal legal channels. The man with corporate plates was likely representing a mining company that had agreed to purchase the rights once they were officially transferred. Sarah had stumbled upon a conspiracy that involved not just family betrayal, but international corruption and corporate fraud on a massive scale. The stakes were even higher than she had realized, and the dangers even more serious than Elena had warned about in her letter. The next morning, Sarah met with attorney Rodriguez to share what she had discovered. The lawyer listened to her account with growing alarm, particularly when she showed him the photographs and video she had taken of Marcus's meeting. "Sarah, this changes everything," Rodriguez said grimly. "If Marcus has already entered into agreements to sell the mining rights, then we're not just dealing with family disputes anymore. We're looking at international fraud, conspiracy, and possibly treason if he's working with foreign agents to steal American-owned assets. What do we do?"
We take this to the FBI. Crimes involving foreign governments and stolen assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars fall under federal jurisdiction. Detective Morrison will need to coordinate with federal agents, but this is now a national security matter. The FBI field office downtown was a fortress of concrete and steel that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who entered. Agent Sandra Flores, who specialized in international fraud cases, examined Sarah's evidence with the methodical attention of someone who had seen similar schemes before. Marcus Martinez has been on our radar for several months, Agent Flores revealed. We've been investigating a network of corrupt officials who facilitate the theft and illegal sale of mineral rights throughout Central America. Your cousin appears to have been recruited as a domestic asset, someone who could provide access to valuable documents through family connections.
Sarah felt sick. How long has this been going on? Based on financial records we've been monitoring, Marcus made his first contact with this network about 18 months ago. He's been receiving payments disguised as consulting fees, probably in exchange for information about your grandmother's documents, and plans to steal them when the opportunity arose. Agent Flores showed Sarah surveillance photographs of Marcus meeting with known criminals and corrupt government officials. The evidence painted a picture of a man who had sold out his own family for money, who had spent over a year planning Elena's betrayal while pretending to be a loving grandson. The good news, Agent Flores continued, is that we now have enough evidence to arrest Marcus and several of his co-conspirators. The bad news is that once we move against them, you'll become a target for anyone else who wants to get their hands on those mining rights. Sarah thought about Elena's letter, about her grandmother's warning that claiming the mineral rights could bring dangerous attention to their family. Elena had been right about the risks, but she probably never imagined that the greatest danger would come from within the family itself. "What kind of protection can you offer?" Sarah asked. "We can provide security during the investigation and trial, but long-term protection would depend on what you decide to do with the mining rights themselves. If you renounce all claims and turn the documents over to the Guatemalan government, the criminal interest in your family would probably disappear." "And if I decide to pursue the legal claims?" Agent Flores' expression grew serious. "Then you'd need to hire private security, probably relocate, and accept that you'd be fighting legal battles for years while dealing with constant threats to your safety and that of your family members." The choice Elena had faced 20 years ago was now Sarah's to make, but with much higher stakes and more immediate dangers. Marcus's betrayal had forced the issue, made it impossible to simply keep the documents hidden and hope the problem would go away. That afternoon, federal agents arrested Marcus at his apartment, along with 3 co-conspirators, including the corrupt Guatemalan official and the corporate representative who had been planning to purchase the stolen mineral rights. The arrests made national news with headlines about international mining fraud and family betrayal that made Sarah's stomach turn. Marcus's arrest photo showed a man who looked nothing like the confident, sophisticated cousin who had delivered Elena's eulogy just days earlier. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his face pale with shock, and his eyes held the desperate look of someone who realized his carefully planned scheme had collapsed around him. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case, Assistant U.S. Attorney James Chen, met with Sarah to discuss her role as a witness in the upcoming trials. The charges against Marcus included fraud, conspiracy, theft of government documents, and violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, crimes that carried potential sentences of 30 years or more in federal prison. "Marcus is already talking," Prosecutor Chen informed Sarah. "He's trying to negotiate a plea deal by providing information about the larger criminal network he was working with. But even with cooperation, he's looking at significant prison time." "What about the mining rights? What happens to them now?" "That's ultimately your decision, Sarah. The documents are legally yours as Elena's heir, and the federal government has no claim to them. But I should tell you that several legitimate mining companies have already expressed interest in purchasing the rights through proper legal channels, and the Guatemalan government has indicated they would honor any valid claims filed through official procedures." Sarah asked for time to consider her options, but she already knew what Elena would have wanted her to do. Her grandmother had spent her entire life putting family before profit, community before personal gain. She'd hidden the documents not because she was afraid of the money, but because she understood that some things were more valuable than wealth. The next morning, Sarah drove to Forest Hills Cemetery, where Elena had been buried just a week earlier. The fresh dirt over the grave was already beginning to settle, and someone had left a small bouquet of marigolds, Elena's favorite flowers, beside the temporary marker. As Sarah knelt beside the grave, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice, speaking the words of wisdom that had guided her through every important decision in her life. Mija, money comes and goes, but family is forever. The choices you make today will determine what kind of person you become tomorrow. Sarah had made her decision. She would not become rich from Elena's hidden documents, but she would honor her grandmother's memory in a way that would have made the old woman proud. Attorney Rodriguez was waiting in his office when Sarah arrived with her final instructions. She wanted to establish a foundation in Elena's name funded by the sale of the mineral rights to a legitimate mining company that agreed to follow environmental and labor standards in their operations. The foundation would provide scholarships for nursing students from immigrant families, fund small business loans for women entrepreneurs, and support programs that help preserve Latin American cultural traditions in the United States. It's what she would have wanted, Sarah explained as Rodriguez drafted the necessary legal documents. Elena spent her whole life helping other people achieve their dreams. This way, her legacy will continue helping families for generations to come. The legal process took months to complete, but when it was finished, the Elena Martinez Foundation was established with an endowment of over $300 million. Sarah kept enough money to pay off her student loans and buy a small house near the hospital where she worked, living the same modest lifestyle that Elena had always believed was the key to true happiness. Marcus was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison after his cooperation with prosecutors helped convict 12 other members of the international mining fraud network. During the sentencing hearing, he tried to deliver a speech about family loyalty and misguided intentions, but the judge cut him off with a sharp reminder that greed, not love, had motivated his crimes. Carmen sent Sarah a letter from Phoenix expressing her pride in the way Sarah had handled the crisis and her certainty that Elena was watching over them with approval. Miguel Rosa framed a newspaper article about the foundation's establishment and hung it in his restaurant, telling customers about the remarkable woman who had turned her grandmother's hidden fortune into a tool for helping others. On the first anniversary of Elena's death, Sarah returned to the small house on Maple Street where volunteers were preparing care packages for immigrant families in need. The rooms that had once echoed with Elena's laughter and wisdom were now filled with the voices of people carrying on her tradition of service and compassion. As Sarah stood in the kitchen where she had learned to make tamales and discovered the hidden documents that had changed her life, she felt a deep sense of peace. Marcus had tried to steal Elena's legacy for his own selfish purposes, but his betrayal had ultimately ensured that Elena's values of family, generosity, and justice would live on in ways that no amount of money could buy. The mineral rights that had caused so much pain and division were now funding scholarships, business loans, and community programs that would help thousands of families achieve their version of the American dream. Elena's hidden fortune had finally found its true purpose, not as a source of wealth for any individual, but as a force for good that would honor her memory for generations to come. Sarah kept one item from Elena's collection of documents, a faded photograph of her great-grandfather standing beside a mining claim in Guatemala, his face serious but hopeful as he posed with the papers that would one day secure his family's future in ways he never could have imagined. The photograph sat on Sarah's desk at the foundation, a reminder that family legacies were not measured in dollars and cents, but in the values passed down from one generation to the next. Marcus had thought he was stealing documents worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but he'd actually stolen something far more valuable, the chance to honor his grandmother's memory and carry on her tradition of putting family before profit. His betrayal had revealed the true difference between wealth and worth, between getting rich and getting things right. In the end, Elena's hidden treasure had been found not in mineral rights or secret documents, but in the love and wisdom she had passed on to a granddaughter who understood that the most valuable inheritance was not what you could take from the world, but what you could give back to it. The Foundation's work continued, day after day, helping families achieve their dreams and preserving the values that Elena had lived by throughout her remarkable life. Sarah had chosen love over money, family over fortune, and justice over personal gain. Choices that would have made her grandmother proud, and that ensured Elena's true legacy would never be forgotten. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.